Today we're going to talk about loading film in your 35mm camera. I've got two different types of cameras here. One is what I would consider an older style camera that you would find anywhere from the 80s all the way back to the earliest 35mm cameras in terms of the basic design of transporting film through the camera. So that would be this Canon AE1 camera, which is a great workhorse camera. And what you'll notice is you'll see a film rewind knob on the top of the camera as compared to a slightly newer camera, which is this is the Nikon F100 that will have an automatic film advance on that. So we're going to talk about how to load each of those kinds of cameras. And I'm going to start out with the older style because it's probably the kind that you'll come into contact more frequently at a thrift store, or they're plentiful, they're all around, and they're great cameras to work with. Before we begin, let's talk a little bit about film. We're going to be working with the Ilford HP5 400 speed film. You have a lot of choices in film for black and white photography, and it really depends on what kind of imagery you plan to make that will determine the kind of film that you use. You have low speed film, which has a very fine grain, and that would be something you would want to use a tripod with, and it would be really good for landscape photography or still life photography where something's not going to move and you want the maximum amount of detail in that image and the ability to enlarge it to the largest size without noticeable grain. The next speed up, or what we'd consider a medium speed film, would be anything in that 100 to 200 range. Most common film types for that would be the Ilford FP4 Plus, which is a ISO 125. T-Max 100 is another medium speed film. And these are typically used for, say, portrait photography in a well-lit situation, either in the studio or outdoors with pretty bright light. And it's a situation where you don't need a lot of depth of field, so you can have your lens open to a wider aperture. So it's a medium speed film, has pretty fine grain as compared to higher speed film. It's kind of a general purpose film. What we're using, though, and what I'm going to recommend for any beginner photographer in particular, and personally the film speed that I use the most in my personal black and white photography, is a 400 speed film. It's a high-speed film, general purpose, meaning I can shoot it handheld in a wide variety of lighting situations, from interior lower light to exterior bright light with high shutter speeds. So this is great for action photography if I want to photograph sports. It's great for candid street photography, which is my personal favorite, where I need to be able to work at a higher shutter speed. 400 speed, I highly recommend it for working with situations like landscape photography where you want deep focus, where you want to stop that lens down all the way to, say, f32, f22, because it's going to allow me to still have a fairly high shutter speed if I want to shoot handheld, or if I start to introduce some color filters to change how my sky is reacting with the blue sky and the clouds. The minute I start putting filters on the camera, I'm lowering the amount of light, so I'm lowering the effective film speed. So if I put for example, a orange filter, which happens to be one of my favorite filters to use, it has a filter factor of 3, which would take the ISO 400 and render it down to closer to an ISO 100, or 125. So it definitely slows things down quite a bit. Okay, so we're going to load our film. Now, if your film comes in a cardboard box like this, we're going to open up this Ilford film. Until you become really familiar with the film that you're working with, I'm going to recommend that you hold on to the cardboard box, because inside of it is important information about development times and different development chemicals you can use. So I would keep at least one copy of that around, or I would go onto the internet and I would look up the film's technical data. And I will just take a moment to talk to you about what films I tend to use the most. And those are going to be typically the Kodak black and white films such as Tri-X and Plus X and T-Max, or the Ilford products, which Ilford's done a great job of keeping film alive for us. The reason I prefer those two companies is because the technical data, the research and development work that has gone into making those products has been made more available to the users of that film product. There's just more information about the qualities and traits of these films than some of the other films. Now, I like to experiment with other film types, such as a Burger, such as a F-key, but that's a topic for a different class where we get into ways in which we can discover and test film to find out its characteristics. But for now, what's nice about this is we have a lot of technical data available to us, or I can download the technical data, and I don't worry about the technical data when I'm out photographing in the field. It's after I've come back with my exposures that I can now look up and figure out what's the best solution for development. Your film will come typically in a plastic container. Nice to hold on to that as well so that we can protect our film in transport. You'll notice that there is a leader to the film that's cut out into a curve, and this helps make loading a little bit easier, and this is something if you ever load your own film from a bulk loader, you'll know to be sure and cut that little notch out, and I actually will have some examples of that later on. For this style of camera that has a manual rewind knob, typically we will open the film by pulling that rewind knob out, and it will spring open when I pull it the rest of the way. So I'm going to open this film back out. Okay, and one of the things you'll notice about these older style cameras is that they have a curtain shutter. In this case, this is a horizontal shutter, and you can see it move, and it's got a fabric curtain to it that travels left to right across the frame, and I'll just slow down the shutter speed so you can actually see that. And there's the curtain going across there. So this is a focal plane curtain shutter, which is a older style shutter. Typically, we want to keep a lens cap on the lens when not in use, because the light can actually, when the lens is on the camera, the light can actually burn a little hole in those curtain shutters. So newer cameras actually went to a metal curtain to alleviate that problem. But just some of the little details that you can look at is to verify that your camera is operating properly. One of the things I like to do is just simply slow the shutter speed down and listen to make sure it's working. There's a slow exposure, and then I'll go to a fast exposure and listen to see how fast it is. And this camera appears to be working properly. So back to film loading. I'm going to take the film, and you'll notice the part that's sticking out the bottom is going to slide in, and push the knob in. I'll pull it across, and for this sort of take-up spool, there's a little notch in there that I can slide that in there, and I'll fire in advance and see, look, I made a mistake. Didn't fully engage there, so I want to stick it in far enough in this case so that the take-up spool will actually engage the sprockets. And now I advance it just to where I see the top, just right in here, the top and the bottom sprockets are engaged. If this was a little loose, I'd pull it back just a little bit, but at this point, all this film is fogged, right? So we're going to close the back, close the rewind knob, and I'm going to continue with my exposure, and you'll notice that when I close the back, the counter always goes back to the start point, and I have to advance the film until the first frame. But now I'm watching to make sure this rewind knob is turning, and you'll notice it's not turning at this point, it's just barely moving. So in that case, I will actually rewind it just slightly until I feel some tension, and then I'll advance it, and now you'll notice it's moving the full 180 degree turn. Okay, so that's how we load this particular camera. On the Nikon here, This is a newer Nikon. Won't get into all the camera features. We could spend a whole 3-hour session just talking about features of different cameras. I will tell you that what this has, though, is a vertical battery grip, so it can be fired in the vertical position or the horizontal position, and the extra power from the battery component drives both the shutter and the light meter for this camera. So this is a camera that's very, very simple to, almost foolproof to load, because all you do is, in this case, there's a button on the side and a lever that you push and slide down that opens the back. I'm going to show you that I can do most of my photography one-handed. Actually, good point here is when loading a camera, you should have a neck strap and put your camera on your neck strap. It is just so critical that I can now work with both hands. I can be taking exposure notes. Just make sure you use a camera strap. It's really important. So I'm going to load the camera, and it's really straightforward. In this case, I'm just going to slide the film in to engage that top spot that holds it across. There's a lot of looseness there that allows it to go in. All I'm doing for this camera, and this, by the way, is you can see a metal curtain on the back, and it's a vertical travel. It looks like almost Venetian blinds because you can just see the metal that will travel vertically, which allows for faster shutter speeds because it has a shorter vertical distance than the horizontal distance on a 24mm by 36mm frame, so a little geometry there for you. With this camera, it's so straightforward. All you do is pull it across and tuck it down. There's no lever, no spot to even tuck it into. I'm just getting it to where the sprocket, again, the top and bottom sprockets are in place, and I close it, and it automatically loads, and I will see the counter on the top LED display says it's gone to frame 1. So it's automatically pulled that fogged film beyond there to get to the first frame, and now it just fires and advances, as compared to this camera, which you push the shutter and you manually rewind or advance the film with the knob here. Some cameras, older cameras, are a double pump where you have to fire and wind twice to get it to the full frame, and this is a single throw, just one pull across there will pull the film all the way across for the frame. So with that, we've got 2 cameras fully loaded, ready to go. We live in this era of digital photography. We have our cell phone, we point, we click a button or touch a screen, and an image is recorded. But when we work with these older cameras, it's a good reminder that there actually is this physical, we're not just operating in a digital world, we're operating in a physical world. And so what I want you to be aware of is that the way a meter works and the way your camera operates and controls exposure starts with calibration to a middle gray value based upon the film sensitivity. What this really means is that light that's coming through the lens has a certain amount of electromagnetic energy. And that electromagnetic energy is hitting a cell and being converted, a photosensitive cell, kind of like, you know, a solar panel, so to speak, and it's converting that into an electrical energy. And what we're doing when we're actually changing any of our camera settings, we're changing the amount of resistance to the current that's formed, and it's balancing those currents out to some sort of equality there. So when I am actually changing the aperture, not only am I changing the diameter of the opening that will allow the light in, but I'm also, for the meter's sake, I'm actually changing the resistance to that voltage of how much light's coming in here to balance it out. And so on some meters, old cameras will see a needle will go up and down. It might as well be like watching a voltage meter. And when it's in the middle, it's balanced out for the calibration of the film sensitivity. So when I am adjusting my shutter dial to control, that's one of the exposure controls, I'm actually changing the resistance to that current, that energy, to balance it out, and the same with the ISO. So what's going on inside the camera body in terms of the electronics is I'm changing the capacity or the resistance to balance that out to a known amount of energy that will produce the proper exposure for that film. Now that we have our film loaded, there's a couple things that I want to make sure we understand before you go out into the field. The first thing is we have 3 exposure controls, and the 3 exposure controls are the ISO, which is the film sensitivity, the shutter speed, and the aperture. So we want to make sure after we've loaded our film that we've changed our ISO. Older cameras will say ASA, even older cameras might say DIN. DIN was the Deutsche International Norm, DIN was the Deutsche Industrial Norm, ASA was the American Standards Association, and then when we became more global, it became ISO, which was the International Standards Organization. ASA and ISO are used interchangeably. They mean exactly the same thing, and they are on the same scale of sensitivity. Newer cameras, like this Nikon, had a DX code reader built into it. It's like a little barcode that's on the film cassette that will automatically set the ISO, or you can manually, in this case, hit the ISO button and you can manually override that DX code. Or if you're using a film cassette that doesn't have a DX code, for example, if I'm bulk rolling my own film into a generic cassette, I have to manually set my ISO. So the first setting is ISO, and then of course our next setting would be our shutter speed, depending upon whether or not we're using a tripod or handheld. If I'm photographing handheld, I need to use a minimum shutter speed of 1 over the focal length. My personal preference is slightly faster than that because, for example, on this camera here, I've got a 50mm lens, which is a normal, what human eyesight sees, pretty close to it anyway. And so the minimum shutter speed I would use with this lens would be 1/60th of a second. So that's kind of the first thing. If I'm going out handheld photography, I'm going to set my shutter speed to 1 over the focal length, just slightly faster than that. In this case, it'd be 1/60th of a second for a 50mm lens. We have 2 sides of our exposure triangle determined. We have the ISO sensitivity of the film set, and we have the shutter speed set to a 60th of a second. And now our third option is going to be our aperture to get proper exposure. And so that's where we're actually looking through our meter and evaluating our exposure setting. Okay, so ISO first, shutter speed second, aperture third. Now we're going to talk about what do you do when you come to the end of the roll. So I'm going to go ahead and start with this older camera, and one of the things you'll notice is when you buy rolls of film, they'll typically for 35mm come in one of 2 of the most standard lengths. One is 24 frames and the other is 36 frames. Okay, the counter will go slightly beyond that. There's sometimes that extra frame if you haven't advanced it all the way at the front, and that's no big deal. But what you will notice is here I'm at 24 frames. I'm going to go ahead and quickly go through the remainder, and the counter is just working its way up. And you can see on this counter it turns, the 36 is orange to get your attention, letting you know you're getting close. And just a little side note, I always leave 1 exposure left on a roll, on my last roll. If I've run out of film and I'm in my last roll and I'm out in the field somewhere, I always leave 1 blank exposure at the end, and I do not unload my camera until I get back to my home or back to the office. And here's why. Invariably, we go out into the world, we go to photograph, we're looking, and invariably when you come back, you see the world so differently, and the shot was right there in the parking lot. And so I've always gotten in the habit of leaving 1 in the camera for that magical moment when you return from your adventure and you go, oh, it was right behind me. So, and then I'll make that exposure, and here's what's going to happen. I can't advance the camera all the way. Now, if you're brand new to photography, you're going to be tempted to try to force that. And one of the things we do in photography is we never force anything. If it gets stiff, we know we're at the end, okay? And we don't force it. What'll happen is you will break the sprocket holes, and your film will be stuck in the camera, and it will make it very difficult. You'll have to go back into the darkroom, pull it out, and you could potentially break the camera. When you break the film advance system, it can be an expensive repair. So just don't force it. And then the other thing that people do that is a real mistake is they go, oh, I'm at the end of the roll, I'll go ahead and shut this down, and I'll immediately flip it over, and I will take the rewind knob and I'll start rewinding, but nothing wants to rewind. And they will crank on it, and again, they will hear this, and what they're hearing is the sprocket holes breaking and the camera breaking because they've forgotten one important thing. The only reason the film is able to advance in one direction is because there's a lock on it that allows it to go one direction. What we have to do is push the film rewind button, and virtually every camera will have it somewhere on the camera body. The Olympus camera body has it on the front. Most camera bodies will have it on the bottom plate. You push that button in and start rewinding. Now, if it's still in good shape, typically once you start rewinding, you can release that button and it'll still freely rewind. Sometimes you have to hold the button the whole time. It just depends on your camera. In this case, I can rewind it and it's spinning nice and smooth. And again, just being deliberate, smooth about the process, you will feel and you will hear when it's starting to come off of there. I just heard it, and all of a sudden, it just spins very, very freely. At that point, I know all the film has been rolled back into the cassette that it came in, which is light tight, and now I can open my camera body and pull out my film cassette, and all the exposed film is in that cassette. If you have an auto advanced camera, typically what will happen is you'll get to your last frame and you'll go click, and you will hear the drive automatically rewind the film for you. So it's done rewinding. And what's nice about these cameras too is it has a little glass window that you can see whether you have film in the camera too. That's one of the things with these older cameras. You always want to look at the knob to make sure it's advancing, because guess what? I can be making exposures and I have no way of knowing if I have film in there or not unless I pay attention to the knob. With this camera, I can see that there's a film cassette in there, and now I can open it up because it's rewound, and voila, we've got our film ready to develop.